Hello, this is the Bureau of Lost Culture, and this is Stephen. Welcome. Do we over-romanticise the counterculture of the 60s, the underground? I think I probably have at times. But in this episode, we're going beneath the surface of that heritage industry version of the period, or of the myth that it was all sweetness and technicolor light, spoiled by a few bad apples, a few bad incidents, and a few bad trips. The shadow side of the 1960s counterculture isn't just a dark footnote. It was woven into the very fabric of the glamour and the myth, right from the beginning. And James Riley, who's my guest today, is a writer whose work explores the darker edges of the 1960s and 1970s. His book, The Bad Trip, is an acclaimed study of apocalypse, occultism, paranoia, and the collapse of the hippie dream. Today we examine that romanticised narrative of peace, love, and idealism, revealing how beneath the surface there lurked a shadow, violence, paranoia, societal fractures. How figures like Charles Manson emerged not as aberrations, but as products, as archetypes of the era. How the underlying currents of violence at events like Altamont, the occult symbolism shaping psychedelic art, were somehow manifestations of that shadow. And for me, that makes it all the more interesting. I mean, from a Jungian perspective, it's the shadow that brings depth, that brings humanity, and a more authentic kind of consciousness. More on that in a minute, but I want to interrupt this program, I want to interrupt myself to thank the people who have joined the Bureau's Patreon to help support this crazy endeavour and all we're trying to do. We're not going to carry ads to persuade you to buy more stuff you don't need with a discount code of. But if you like, you can contribute to what we need. Go to bureauoflostculture.com. Doesn't need to be financial, by the way. Encouragement and support in kind is very kind too. bureauoflostculture.com. Back to today. According to James Riley, the cultural legacy of the 60s isn't just in its groundbreaking music and art, but in its unresolved tension, seeds that grew into modern social movements, from feminism to civil rights. And in this conversation, we explore why understanding that shadow of the 60s matters. We get into countercultural films, LSD, the Trickster archetype, Charles Manson of course, John Lennon and Yoko Ono, the Committee for the Summer of Love, and we tune in to see how the darkness beneath the light reveals more about human nature than the utopian stories we often tell. So, as Stephen Duffy sings, blow out the candles, kick off your sandals. Here we go. Welcome to the Bureau of Lost Culture, James.
Hi, Stephen. Thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Let's dive into what I would call the sort of shadow side of the counterculture. And in The Bad Trip, I suppose the way I see it is that in some ways it's providing a wider exploration of the counterculture, or deeper actually, I suppose you could say it that way. But also in some ways it seems to me that it's sort of trying to address a kind of over-romantic view about those times, which maybe we've all had, that it was a time of peace and love and everything was going great, and then it all sort of went wrong. But I think for you, the going wrong bit, the shadow bit, was sort of in there from the beginning. Like, what drew you to this, let's call it the darker underside of 60s counterculture, rather than the, it's more familiar utopian mythology?
And I mean, I've always been really interested in 60s culture from a very early age. Parents' record collection, other in bands in the 60s, growing up listening to sounds of the 60s on the radio, beats at Top of the Pops and all this kind of stuff. Very vibrant culture, also very accessible culture. It was a very easy popular culture to get hold of. But it also seemed to be full of a sort of underlying sinisterness, darkness element. That was also very easy to access. And that might have been just due to the way in which, say, the 90s was choosing to represent the 60s through its culture industry, its culture machine, what it was choosing to repeat on television late at night. But I certainly found things like The Prisoner the slightly weirder episodes of the Avengers, Jason King, Department S, all this kind of stuff. That was kind of my entry in. And then you didn't really have to go very far to start looking at things like Sergeant Pepper and think and see, well, there's Aleister Crowley, there's William Burroughs. And then even when you were watching these kind of repeat shows, you could see some kind of folkish group or pop group, and then all of a sudden there's Arthur Brown with his head on fire on mainstream TV, tea time TV. That intersection, which again, I was very much aware that this was a certain kind of retrospective packaging. That intersection really kind of interested me from mid-teens onwards. And there was a very early and probably too soon exposure to Stanley Booth's book about the Rolling Stones, which goes into a lot of detail about Altamont. Too early exposure as a teenager to Helter Skelter and reading about Charles Manson. First thinking that Charles Manson was some kind of lead singer of some kind of band, but that's, I suppose, not too far away from the truth when you actually get into it. There was an enthusiasm there. It sort of persisted that at the same time as I was getting more into this culture and investigating it from a scholarly position, a professional position, I started to work quite closely with people like Peter Whitehead, started to interview people. As you said, that shadow side is exactly the right way to put it. It was always there. And it was always very easily accessible. And it wasn't really a sort of subterranean perspective. It seemed to be bound very much into the culture of the decade. And I guess what I wanted to talk about, prod away at that persistent myth of the 60s ending in some kind of catastrophe, telling some of the stories that feed into that myth. Altamont, Manson murders, moon landing, to a lesser extent, Woodstock, but also trying to uncover a little bit more of that alternate mirrored view, that shadow side, that darkness, which is not just in terms of, say, people getting into the occult and, say, Kenneth Anger and thinking about the age of Aquarius as being an age of apocalypticism. You start to come across all these sort of factoids, like, for example, the growth of motorways across the 1960s. There's the country connecting itself, but it also opened out traffic for organized crime. That's how organized crime networks also moved across the country. So that it was almost as if those things are absolutely there. In the same way that you think about the Krays hanging out with aristocrats and politicians, sort of the great and the good, in London in the 60s, that sort of flip side, it also filters into other elements of the decade that it seems to be always there. That kind of slightly kind of strange, sinister, violent, sort of malevolent underside is there, and you can cut the decade across and open it out. It will be there at every level.
I mean, from my point of view, this narrative that the 60s was all going great and then a few things happened at the end and it all went bad, that seems very, very naive. The fact that the shadow side, as you describe it, this underside, the underbelly, was there from the beginning, for me, always made it richer, actually. It didn't seem to be, in a way, something which diminished it. You could even say, in a Jungian sense, the fact that there's a shadow to things actually makes it more interesting, more human, actually, and, sort of more real in a sort of odd way, rather than we had this extraordinary golden few years. And tragically, the age of Aquarius didn't come. And you mentioned a lot of things which we're going to get into. And maybe we can start actually with Manson because, it's central to your understanding in a way of what happens, because he's not the aberration, I think, for you, is he? In a sense, he's the sort of dark clown. As an archetype, any kind of symbol, any kind of archetype generates its opposite. So for you, he's very significant, isn't he? And what happens with Manson, with the Tate LaBianca murders?
Yeah, he's a very significant figure, and I don't really go down the line of him being a significant figure because he's sort of some kind of misunderstood philosopher or kind of outlaw priest. I didn't want to go down the sort of Mansonoid sort of cultist view, but I was more sort of, and also every time you talk about this, one also has to think that you are talking about a terrible event in which he was the architect. There's an enormous amount of human wreckage there, which one must respect. I also don't really agree with the idea that he's this sort of great anomaly. I think he grows very much out of the culture. He obviously exploits it. He's able to understand what that culture is and in some ways give people exactly what they want, which is the skill of the cult leader to give people what they want, to offer people what they want. But on a more social level, if not wanted to be too pretentious, a more structural level, he was required by the culture at large. So by the time we get to the late 1960s, the culture at large was wanting and requiring someone to fill this Manson-shaped hole. right, in order to, push back against the seeming progressivism. And I don't mean that in a conspiratorial sense. I know there's a lot of conspiracy theory, both founded and unfounded, evidential and not, connected to the Manson murders. I mean it more in terms of the way that you're implying the kind of archetypal level, the symbolic level, the structural level. The culture, both in terms of its counterculture and the so-called establishment, both in some ways really needed a figure like Manson at that particular time to really become the repository of what a lot of people were thinking, a lot of social anxieties. And also, if you like, to lay the blame elsewhere. When you have a singular figure who emerges, it means that you can, if you like, push forward with a lot of things by pointing to this bad apple.
Well, even if, don't go on the route of the sort of the more racy conspiracy theories, I interviewed Tom O'Neill a few years ago, and Tom has sort of spent his entire life, when he's not driving Uber, investigating Manson, particularly the actual court cases and all that stuff. And, obviously for Tom, Manson, at least partly, was manufactured, a sort of experiment that went badly wrong. I suppose that's what the implication is. But you say something else as well, which is that, you've got a counterculture that is rejecting traditional authority, and that's kind of wonderful, but it also leaves a vacuum. And that vacuum is quite easily filled by charismatic figures. And he was one of them, right? He was quite useful to the mainstream culture because they were able to hold him up as see what happens, with all this hippy-dippy shit, but also he wouldn't have really come about if some of that hippy-dippy stuff hadn't been around, because admirably in some ways pulling down authority and unsettling all these existing moral conventions, it did leave this vacuum which people like Manson could step into.
Yeah, fundamentally, Manson was a little bit older. You talk about Manson as a hippie, he was a little bit older than the people he was associating with. Basically, Manson is fundamentally a con man. And a lot of what he did in the later 1960s, he'd already done in the late 1950s and early 1960s. He was effectively a con man and a pimp. The classic sort of meeting people off the bus, pretending to be a producer, gaining the trust, isolating from the friends, being the singular individual, and then in most cases, forcing them into prostitution of one form or another. And he was actually sent to jail for trafficking across state lines and all the crimes that one would associate with that. So when he gets out of jail, when he gets paroled in the later 1960s, he heads to San Francisco, which is amenable to parolees, and he sees a very similar culture to the one he was trying to exploit best part of a decade earlier. But he shifted his language. It wasn't, I can get you a record contract, I can get you to meet film stars. It was, I can give you meaning, I can give you purpose. In jail, he'd already got into Scientology. He'd learned a lot about manipulation, both from his fellow prisoners, but also that kind of cultish mechanism. So it was the same con, but the language was different. He was exploiting the culture as he saw it. And as you said, the con worked by him realizing the fact that people were looking for something. The whole kind of generation of people who were actually looking for guidance, seemed to be given something, looking for something more. And he was able to exploit that. In that sense, he's not so much an anomaly, but a product of that culture, in the sense that he was someone else who was able to work out his language, work out his codes, work out people's desires, and play to that. That's how he operated as an individual, as a project, as it were, how he actually gained the trust and was able to exploit these people to such an extent. The wider culture at the time also sort of needed that character in order to point to, this is what's wrong with the culture, this is why we can't allow it to carry on. As you said, this is what happens when you let young people try to rule the world. They start killing each other.
Plus the other, big thing, which is often quoted as one of the death knells of the 60s, is Altamont. And again, it's like a sort of shadow version of Woodstock, isn't it? Woodstock, in a way, with all its kind of craziness and faults and, and its massively romanticized versions that we sort of have now, it was the sort of musical ideal of how this story could play out. And then Altamont comes, and maybe that's the shadow side of that beautiful vision.
It's the shadow side that actually tells us a little bit more about Woodstock and the way in which Woodstock has been romanticized. Because on one level, it's a shadow side because, of course, Woodstock is 3 days of peace and love. Everyone has a great time. It's a kind of semi-autonomous gathering, and it generates all these beautiful images and so on, and fabulous performances, which are now part of our culture. Altamont comes along. It's badly organized. It's organized by people who don't really understand what they're doing and don't really understand how to run an event of that size. They get involved through sort of naivety and arrogance on the part of the Rolling Stones, who of course weren't at Woodstock, who were slightly aside from the kind of culture and language that it was promoting. They get involved with the American Hells Angels, which are not the same as the British Hells Angels. They're not sort of, boisterous motorcycle fans. They're very different. And that combination of bad planning, bad logistics, arrogance, naivety, short-sightedness offers a combustible mix with the people that are there. And the idea of communality, of course, is somewhat flushed away in terms of the loss of life that takes place at that event. Also, a way in which the Rolling Stones kind of deal with it. Let's get out of here. They just fly away, leave everyone else to sort of tidy it up. And of course, it's filmed, which is another sort of shadow side to Woodstock, because of course, Woodstock was filmed as well. But the Maysles brothers have this sort of perfect set of images within it that makes that film Gimme Shelter so much more than just a document of a concert. But I guess the thing that, you can eat, there's all kinds of really easy ways you can say, well, look, one's the sort of apotheosis of the counterculture in terms of possibility, and the other one is this terrible event. But the thing is, a lot of the way we understand that narrative comes from the way in which we have remembered Woodstock and the way in which it has been sort of commodified.
Yeah.
Because what we're kind of thinking of is we're thinking of the fabulous film. We're thinking of the way in which it plays out as this beautiful, glorious lost memory in, say, The Omega Man, where Charlton Heston's watching said film, he's sort of remembering the world that could have been, and the way that it's been sort of endlessly kind of commodified. In the same way that we remember Altamont, obviously terrible things happened there, but we also remember it due to the sort of the way in which it intersects with things like performance, due to the fact that it seems to take place in this terrible apocalyptic wasteland at the very end of the year. But if you look at Woodstock, people also died at Woodstock, if you look at it as an event, right? Its body count was very similar. There was also violence and discord at Woodstock. We don't see it, or for whatever reason, we choose not to remember it. It was a free festival by default.
I think that's it. We need it to be how we imagine it now, don't we? Because we needed to keep that vision of the genuine beauty and wonderfulness that was, a big part of the 60s. But one of my big associations, I suppose, with the 60s is the esoteric, the mystic. There's this kind of return of the mystic. There's a return of theosophical theories. And of course, you've got Crowley as well, who sort of disappeared in a way. Even before his death, he'd fallen out of fashion. He'd sort of disappeared down to Hastings was living in a kind of retirement home, eating eggs and morphine. And yet he gets sort of retaken up. And these things come together, say, with Kenneth Anger and making this unfinished film, Lucifer Rising. And that really struck out to me as this sort of symbolic thread, which linked this shadow side of the counterculture and the culture.
You're absolutely right. There tends to be, if you look on a sort of wider, longer history, there always tends to be a sort of resurgence in so-called magical thinking, historical moments of change and crisis. But at the same time, the cultural, material and economic, if not political circumstances, has also got to be right for it. And when you think about the 1960s, when you think about its demographic, when you think about the kind of people who were talking about these ideas, they've got to get those ideas from somewhere. There's a version in paperback market. It's a highly educated, very imaginative, very creative young generation who are also questioning the parental stem. They're questioning structures, the nuclear family, a certain way of working, but also, certainly in America, very, very obviously, those combined religious and political views that create this kind of wider, very structured, very hierarchical society, which to that generation immediately after the Second World War has failed. It's not delivered on its promises. You see this in terms of both the delusionment for the Vietnam generation, but also the anti-nuclear protest, the Older Master marches, so on and so forth from the early 1960s. That sense of, well, this wider set of structures that we're meant to believe in has not worked. So as a result of movement away, that literal turning against the father in all kinds of ways, the esoteric and magical thinking comes along to supercharge that and give it a language, give it a code, give it a discourse. One central tenet is that sense of realize oneself, be self-led, here are the tools and here's the equipment for you to actually shape reality in accordance with one's own will. So it's almost as if esoteric thinking, occultism, is the sort of tool to follow up that political intent.
But also on a kind of more cosmic level, you've got people, like Gavin Arthur, with this idea that the humanity is entering the age of Aquarius. So that this isn't just about the 60s and San Francisco and Haight-Ashbury and, LSD. Yeah, those things are in there. But no, there's actually a cosmic shift, that this is a new age. It went on to become the new age, in fact, later on. But This is a cosmic transition towards peace and expanded consciousness, a big belief, which really inspire people. When you mentioned then about the family stem, and that I recently rewatched The Graduate, what a great film The Graduate is, and how funny it is. I'd sort of forgotten that it's actually a comedy, The Graduate. But the brilliant thing about it, of course, is that it is that world that you're talking about, the post-war American world of convenience food and automobiles and shiny advertising. And in it, the main character, he's sick of that, isn't he? He's got this existential nausea at that. But it also gives us this wonderful, at the end, particularly, romantic idea that you can escape it. And in Simon & Garfunkel's latest song, America, that you can go off to this other place, go west, actually, and maybe grow your hair and do all that sort of stuff. What I really love about that film is that you could sort of say it plays straight into the sort of hippie narrative. But at the end, when they're sitting on the bus together and they've escaped, her marriage and the parents and all that, they both sort of look down and think, what the fuck are we going to do?
The weight
Because
of it.
the weight of it, that's it, right? You've broken all those ties and you've sort of, you set yourself counterculturally against all that stuff. And then what do you do?
It's like what The Graduate shows is that culture before it gets the language to talk about itself, to conceptualize itself. And, when you are thinking about something like the Age of Aquarius, I think the reason why that became so kind of iconic and sort of talismanic is that it was almost a question that you could give to those couples who were expressing, I don't like this, I don't want this is not the life that I want to cultivate my own sense of self. What you can get from, say, magical ritualism and sort of magical practice is that sense of, well, here's the way to find your own sense of self, whether you call that the holy guardian angel or realizing oneself or one's soul. But that wider cosmic understanding, that wider cosmic paradigm is that this is why it is necessary. So it is not just one's own individual and personal proclivities or hobbies, the thing you might do after work. It's socially and culturally necessary because we're about to move into this different paradigm. And I think something like The Graduate, it's showing that kind of embryonic anxiety, like beats becoming hippies, the kind of situation that we see in The Graduate. It's on the tip of everyone's tongue. We just gave it a name, right? The Age of Aquarius helps to give a real name and gives a real almost kind of cosmic manifesto, these feelings. But of course, buried within that, this is where we begin to get to the apocalyptic thinking, because we think about the Age of Aquarius and we think about the absolutely joyful pop song, which talks about brotherhood and love and brings to mind people quite, dancing in the streets. And why wouldn't you? It's an absolutely beautiful song. We think about hair and all the rest of it. But when you actually break down the Age of Aquarius as a cosmological idea, what it means is a period of great tribulation is coming. Right, a period of great upset and trial is coming. That is what is necessary for the period of brotherhood to follow. It is absolutely necessarily a period of chaos and catastrophe. That is what it inaugurates. I guess this comes down to the point that we began with, that it's not, when we think about this dark side or shadow side or however we want to call it, that is absolutely inscribed into the internal thinking of the counterculture.
Right, so it's there in the cosmic myth too.
Yes, it is. We've sort of eased over it due to how great certain pop songs are that sing about it.
Just to sort of tie off that thread on The Graduate, for me, the counterpoint to The Graduate is a British film made about the same era, as in its subject is the same era, although it was made in the 80s, about another couple, and it's another comedy, which is With Nail and I. And the thing about With Nail and I, it's a bromance, right? And even though it was made in, I think, 80s or early 90s, it's about the late 60s, and it's about the end of the 60s, right? Isn't it? It's about, in a sense, how a couple, in this case, two men, don't make it through. And in fact, it seems like it's almost catastrophic, particularly for one of them. And of course, there is that very famous phrase from it, they're selling hippie wigs in Woolworths. And it's like that notion of breaking away from the crass commercialism that had started to take over in the post-war period has now come back, where, the hippie ideal itself is being appropriated by the Woolies of all people, right?
Yeah.
So it's an odd pairing, I think, with those two films, but they do seem to pin something down between them.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It would make a really good double bill, in the sense of they seem to be kind of counterintuitive, but they work together. It's almost as if what happens in With Nail and I is kind of what could happen to that couple who drive off at the end of The Graduate. Where are they going to live? What are they going to do?
Yeah.
What's going to happen to their ambitions? Are they going to make this life sustainable? Because it's a bromance with no eyes. Basically, it's a failed marriage. It's a failed relationship. And they're unable to sustain two lifestyles. The sort of London sort of late 60s performance-y, aristocratic, sort of seemingly kind of decrepit sort of London house. They're not able to live like Turner, right? Because they need money, they need work, the material needs are also there, but they also can't get it together in the country either. That is also a disappointment and ruined for precisely the same reason.
It is.
Because it kind of continually highlights the sort of material needs which they're not able to meet.
Right. And the I figure in With No Now, we never find out his actual name. Basically what happens is that he grows up, he decides that he's got this opportunity to get a proper job, cut his hair. Whereas Withnail himself, of course, he's trapped within his own failed vision. We sort of hop across the Atlantic and stay on this side for a while in terms of the British counterculture. Another very significant point in the mid-60s had been an event which we've had, discussed on this show before, which is the film that Peter Whitehead made, Holy Communion, of this poetry event, which lots of people think sort of kickstarted in some ways, or at least turbocharged the British counterculture. And you met Whitehead, right? Tell us what Holy Communion and that event means.
Whitehead had a very particular take on it. Holy Communion, it really set up his career. It certainly set up his career for the 1960s, and it opened some doors for him. But he was always very sort of cynical, slightly skeptical of the fact that he managed to sort of capture the counterculture at its birth, because he always used to say that his film also happened that night at the Albert Hall, that he was very much aware of the fact that he was cultivating a certain image. There was the event, which has its own significance in some way, and then there was his film, which was a completely different object. In terms of its historical significance, and Holy Communion is, although it's only, of course, half an hour of a 4 or 5 hour event, I think it still does a very good job of encapsulating and crystallizing a lot of the symbolism and I think the potentiality. And although people like Ginsberg were very critical of the event, of their own performance and a lot of the other performers, and yes, it was a chaotic event, I think in some ways it did do its job as a kind of catalyst for the British counterculture, because a lot of the people who attended it, they talk about the scale of it, they talk about the size of it, they talk about what an impact that had on them. That, a couple of months before, they were sat in the back room of some bookshop amongst 20 other people talking about this stuff, and then suddenly there's thousands of people filling the Albert Hall, the biggest venue they could possibly find. And it is the kind of, in some ways, the injection of American beat poetry that kind of gave the so-called underground, gave it a certain kind of confidence, gave it a certain sense that, yes, you can achieve these things, but also that sense of, yes, there's a lot more people here who are interested in this than what one might have first thought. And that sense of a sort of community gathering, that sense of this could be a sort of, to a certain extent, something of a mass movement, as well as rather than just a sort of marginal pursuit. I think that was the main benefit and the main sort of impetus, the main fuel that came out of that event. Whitehead himself was always very skeptical about how authentic, how accurate that film was, but he was also very much aware that it kickstarted his career. I mean, he won awards. He got in a lot of networking opportunities, and it sort of enabled him to cultivate this career across the 1960s, which went in a very peculiar way, but still always had a sort of a grounding in the sense that he was documenting or at least witnessing what came after.
I mean, I'm still amazed anyway that to fill the Albert Hall with an audience to come to listen to poetry. I mean, that seems to me to be an extraordinary thing. I mean, one of the very wonderful things I think about those years was that poetry itself had such a galvanizing effect that so many people would want to go and hear it. And then, the ripples spread outwards from that moment. I mean, we did a whole thing about Ginsberg in London a couple of years ago, and we actually watched the film again. And, and I think, God, I think it'd be wonderful these days if poetry could have such a transformatory effect. You talk about a lot of other films as well.
Here is a sidebar about some of the films that we mention in this episode, many of which, by the way, I haven't seen myself, but I'm looking forward to watching. First off, Holy Communion. This is the Peter Whitehead film from 1965, the beat poetry gathering at the Royal Albert Hall, which documented Britain's emerging underground culture. Roger Corman's The Wild Angels, 1966, a violent, nihilistic biker film starring Peter Fonda that helped establish the outlaw motorcycle gang as a countercultural archetype. Roger Corman's The Trip of 1967, psychedelic LSD odyssey exploring altered consciousness in the expanding hippie worldview. Hell's Angels on Wheels, this is Richard Rush's 1967 flick where Jack Nicholson drifts into biker culture in a film that balances freedom, alienation and social menace. I talked a bit about The Graduate, which I rewatched recently. That's Mike Nichols' amazing film from 1967. It's so funny, I've forgotten how funny it is. Suburban alienation and generational revolt beneath affluent American conformity. James mentioned Rosemary's Baby, the Roman Polanski film from 1968, psychological horror in which urban modernity, paranoia and occult conspiracy undermine domestic security and the counterculture era promise of liberation. Easy Rider, of course, Dennis Hopper's 1969 directorial debut, I think. Countercultural bikers cross America seeking freedom and violence and meet intolerance. Gimme Shelter, that's the Maysles brothers documentary of the Rolling Stones' doomed Altamont concert and the darkening of the 1960s dream. Also involved in that was Charlotte Zwerin, a rare woman in this list. Then of course there was Nicholas Roeg's Performance, Identity, Sex, Violence and Rock Culture Blur in psychedelic Notting Hill in London. And what about Zabriskie Point? The Pink Floyd scored radical youth politics and anti-capitalist disillusionment in dreamlike America. Jodorowsky's El Topo from 1970, mystical acid western blending violent Zen imagery, surreal spiritual allegory. Michael Wadley's 1970 film Woodstock, that's probably what most of us associate with that event, celebratory documentary portrait of the counterculture's musical and communal peak. John Lennon and Yoko Ono's Apotheosis, minimal conceptual film showing a single balloon ascending into the sky, transforming Fluxus-style simplicity into a meditation on transcendence, impermanence and liberation. Richard Sarafian's Vanishing Point, 1971, existential road movie about speed, freedom and anti-authoritarian escape. The one I mentioned, which I love actually, Two Lane Blacktop, that's Monty Hellman's 1971 film, sparse meditation on drifting masculinity and America's empty highways. Lucifer Rising was Kenneth Anger's film, which was kind of completed in 72 and then 1980, and I think a new version has just been released, an occult ritual film steeped in esotericism, pagan symbolism and psychedelic imagery. And with Neil and I, Bruce Robinson's 1987 tragicomedy, a melancholic elegy for the burnt-out remains of the 1960s Bohemian Dream.
In terms of the darkness, you mentioned Rosemary's Baby, which I haven't seen for years, but what a great film. And of course, Performance, right? Vanishing Point, El Topo, and The Omega Man. So, I mean, talk a bit about how this shadow side infiltrated and influenced the directors and made those kind of films too.
Yeah, well, you have a lot of mercurial individuals. It's got a lot of people who are emerging out of the so-called underground who could be seen as kind of countercultural artists. If you look at El Topo and Jodorowsky, there's someone who has this background in experimental and avant-garde theatre, effectively happenings, right? And then through a series of connections and the right kind of budget and the right kind of money to make this very experimental and quite transgressive film, El Topo. But El Topo is also a film which is drawing upon an existing genre and very popular genres, effectively the Western. It's a take on that. And at the same time, you've also got various kinds of exploitation filmmakers also looking at this emergent culture, starting to make the kind of B movies, there's biker movies, whatever, which is drawing upon what they see as a new and vibrant youth culture. And that kind of intersection, which is both, if you like, the avant-garde moving to slightly more of a mainstream, and then the mainstream also looking to what they can see or interpret of an avant-garde or an underground, produces some very interesting works of popular cinema, whether that is Roger Corman's The Trip, right? Okay. Or things like Zabriskie Point, Vanishing Point. These directors who are quite young, who are quite clued into the culture, who are wanting to use this popular form in one sense to kind of reflect on this social movement, but also to make quite a number of political points. It's both sides, as it were, realizing the vibrancy, the energy, and the potential radicalism of the popular film.
Easy Rider, which it's a tragedy, right?
Yes, it's a tragedy, but it's also a tragedy that is seen through the eyes of the makers of that, the producers of that culture, or, for want of a better phrase, effectively of that same demographic. Dennis Hopper, Peter Fonda, Jack Nicholson. Although they're film stars at this time, they're not quite the absolute iconic film stars in the way that the sort of position that we now put them in. They're kind of circulating through these circles. They're obviously well established, but there's still people who are still very much connected to that Laurel Canyon LAC. Something like Easy Rider, it has the shape and the sort of form of a kind of exploitation biker film. They'd already played through these roles in things like Hell's Angels on Wheels, Naked Angels, and all the rest of it. But it's more like it is then finally a statement of that generation, then as young people from that milieu, through the equipment and the lens that they actually have and the opportunity to make a film. And you're absolutely right, it is a tragedy. It's a kind of tragic Western. They make the sort of bold move of not offering out a kind of impossible utopia and not doing the kind of defeat the bad guys and they ride off into the sunset. They sort of present themselves being annihilated, a sort of image of the fragility of the culture that they see themselves in. Like, look at the forces that are opposing us. When it comes down to it, we're sort of three guys on two motorbikes, and that's kind of all it is, right? Against these hugely massed social and political forces. So, there's a tremendous kind of energy that goes into that, but it's the same with something like Vanishing Point. It is a spectacular catastrophe towards the end. These are films that speak of the fragility and the short-termism of the culture out of which they emerge.
Well, also, I mean, it's not talked about so much these days, but I always loved it, which is Two Lane Blacktop. That sort of film from 1971. And who's in it? James Taylor. The musician, and Dennis Wilson, and it's a cult classic, but it sort of captures this sort of disillusionment, doesn't it, of that era. That's why, for me, this notion of the shadow actually makes the counterculture more interesting. It makes it culturally more deep, and the artworks, the films, the music, the literature which incorporates it is better for it. It's better for it that it isn't sanitized and romanticized with sort of fairy dust in our memory.
Yeah, certainly it gives it a lot more gravitas because these are not films or books in which everyone's just having a great time. These are not invitations to some kind of Dionysian excess, although that's not without interest. And it certainly gives the culture of more gravitas and more depth and more weight. And seems to be, even if his message is somewhat nihilistic, it also seems that he's got more to say. But I mean, I think also thinking about the 60s from this perspective also gives the so-called counterculture more political depth at the same time, because it helps us move away from this idea that it's this sort of solipsistic lotus eater kind of pleasure dome experience. If you look at something like the so-called Summer of Love, I mean, various people have written about this. And I mean, you just look at that phrase itself, you look at that and you immediately think kind of day-glow, the stuff you wear for sort of 60s fancy dress evenings and all this kind of stuff. But the phrase itself comes from the Committee for the Summer of Love. That the sort of community leaders leading up to 1967 were aware that because of the exposure that the area was getting, that summer they were going to see a massive influx of young people from all over the country. The curious, runaways, people who want to spend the summer, people who've got nowhere else to go. And effectively, we're talking about a very small area, a very small enclave of San Francisco that they knew was going to swell. And that they knew also people were also going to be looking at how they dealt with this. So the Committee for the Summer of Love was basically trying to say, how are we actually going to infrastructurally deal with this? And the language of love that comes out of it is actually a language of care. It's a language of conviviality. They're saying the only way that we can actually try to sustain ourselves as a functional, autonomous community is to treat everyone who comes in as if they are our sisters and our brothers. We can't just look after our own selves on our own property. So we've got to share what we've got. And everyone who comes here has got to take on that communal responsibility. And that's the message that we need to put out. There's something very hopeful there, but there's also something that comes with a real ominous sense of responsibility. Like, we're going to be severely tested and observed in the next few months. And there's going to be all these people that we need to seriously look after, and how we're going to do it. So by moving away from the summer of love of just sort of throwing flowers at each other and having a great time and just not working and hoping that the universe will look after you, that's absolutely not what that phrase was about. And even when you look at it from a Beatles perspective, all you need is love. All you need is love because the world around them seemed to be so sorely lacking it.
Right.
We're in such a chaotic mess that need for conviviality and humanity takes on this kind of crisis-fueled extremity, this absolute necessity. So once you start breaking down these stereotypes and look at where they come from, out of, say, these early 2000s sort of culture industry, nostalgia industry version, you begin to see the buried politics, you begin to see the buried crisis, the buried sense of emergency that's informing them. That is a kind of anxiety-fueled darkness to it, but at the same time, it gives it a lot more seriousness. It gives it a lot more political thrust that it so often seemed to lack.
Well, it also reveals, I think, some of the heroism involved. I mean, a couple of years ago, I interviewed Dr. Dave, who set up the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic back in 66, I think, or that summer, actually, anyway, basically, you know. He's still alive, by the way, and he's still there, the clinic. He talked about, this influx of young people, the couple from The Graduate, I suppose, you know, throwing off the chains of their upbringing and arriving, you know, and it being total chaos. People with sexually transmitted diseases, people malnourished, people with all sorts of other medical issues, and also people who were casualties of literal bad trips. And maybe we could talk a little bit about that, because there is something extraordinary about LSD, and it has been the alchemical catalyst for all sorts of incredible things. And certainly at the beginning of the 60s, you know, with Huxley and Timothy Leary, had this huge optimism around it, you know, with Ken Kesey, how we're going to change the world through acid. But as the decade went on, you know, all sorts of other things started to come in, didn't it? People breakdown and of course, in Manson's case, manipulation, this growing paranoia as well. You know, that's the shadow side of the psychedelics, isn't it? Interestingly, we're living in this so-called psychedelic renaissance at the moment, but the first psychedelic age, if you want to call it that, of the 60s, certainly had its dark side too, didn't it?
Yeah, very much so. And it's not just a sort of set of events that cause a wonderful thing to somehow go wrong. It's almost like not the human agency that causes it to go wrong. It's the weirdness, and I mean weirdness quite specifically, almost in a Lovecraftian sense of weirdness, the weird nature of LSD that causes those experiences and those events. I don't think it's any coincidence that Leary chose the Tibetan Book of the Dead as a guidebook for this experience. And the thing is that, you know, I'm sure there's all kinds of people that can speak in greater depth about the psychopharmacology of LSD, but its effects are so hard to regulate and to predict. And there's still lots of things about it that are very difficult to understand and to properly map. Its effects being incredibly subjective and also being open to all kinds of additional feedback loops. That's to say, if you have an entire weekend free, you're in a beautiful Malibu beach house, and you're surrounded by friends who love you, and the air is wafting in and classical music is playing, you're probably going to have a great time. Right? But if you are in unfamiliar circumstances, unfamiliar surroundings, there's lots of audiovisual stimulus going on, which you're not particularly comfortable with, surrounded by people you are completely unfamiliar with, it's highly likely that that's going to be a terrible experience, right? With the same substance. There's nothing actually about it that elevates it to the level of the heavenly. It depends very, very heavily on what Leary and others call the set and the setting. Your own mindset, either going into it or your own fundamental mindset, and the context in which you experience it and explore it, which is why a lot of those earlier, those kind of pioneers, as it were, those researchers who take it very seriously, were wanting to sort of guide and mediate and sort of care for the people who were taking those substances, and it wasn't to be taken lightly. You know, the sort of Huxley vision about it being, it's not just sort of mimicking delusions or mimicking psychosis, as it was originally thought from a research perspective. It's opening up an experience which is, from Huxley's perspective, of genuine existential significance. That's why there's all this language of and metaphors of doors and doorways and other worlds. difficult, as if it is opening up something which is valid in terms of a state of being that it opens one into, but it's very difficult to get comprehensive and full knowledge of that state, which makes for fabulous experiences, but incredibly unpredictable experiences, and something that is that volatile, even in so-called controlled situations, also opens out users to states of vulnerability. So making it a kind of sacrament and part of the way in which the Manson family organization works, but also effectively something that he can use to manipulate people and to put them in circumstances and situations that they're not prepared for, that they're not comfortable with, and exploit them in all kinds of ways. But at the same time, it manages also to promote this wider culture of psychedelia, a cultural feedback loop, which is effectively, to misquote Spaceman 3, taking drugs to make music to take drugs to. There's the thinking about, there's the imbibing of the psychedelic substances, there's the culture that emerges out of the culture that somehow tries to express it in some way and to crystallize it in some way, which adds further to the proliferation of the use of the drug itself. And of course, anytime you want to actually, fully culturally entangle something, just ban it, just render it illegal, which of course happened during the 1960s, which also kind of give it a much stronger sense of cultural primacy. Essentially, to carry on with our central symbol for this, that it has the self and the shadow built within it. That darkness is within it, because it is almost as if it is a being and a thing extra to the human that has somehow waited for its moment to emerge when you start looking into the sort of origin stories, as it were, of LSD.
Yeah, absolutely. You could say it as a sort of the chemical embodiment, the chemical avatar, somewhat of like the trickster archetype. The thing with the trickster is, the trickster's a disruptor. He, she, it is neither good nor bad. I mean, it can, and of course, whatever side you think the trickster's on, it's going to overturn that at some point, and you're going to be on the losing side. So many people were inspired to do wonderful things in the arts, of course, but, in politically, socially, by their experience of LSD. I've talked to many of them, diggers, this wonderful group that believed, in free, things should be free, and then you got events like the Being and Human Being and, communal living products and like, the underground newspapers, all this stuff, inspired often, partly at least, by the use of acid, to create this new society, which was going to be beyond capitalism and conventional morality. But of course, it came with this sort of price. Say, talking to Peter Coyote, he was a digger, talking to Barry Miles. Miles said this interesting thing about the 69. He says that we were all exhausted. Been too much sex, too much drugs. There'd been too much experimentation, but he was worn out. I mean, in his case, Allen Ginsberg gave him a refuge, on his farm, because he could see that Miles himself was just burnt out. They were exhausted by it all. It was too much. In Peter Coyote's case, he became a heroin addict. And even though they left the city and they went to live on the communes and threw up their hands and we can't make this thing happen, so we're going to retreat into the countryside. We're going to kind of get away from society rather than transform it. That darkness often went with them.
Yeah, very much so, because I think that something like LSD, the sort of main value of it is it opens up another world. And I think the creativity that one sees on the part of people who have taken LSD and really explored it and enjoyed it and got a lot out of it is because it opens up a sense of possibility. It opens up the fact that there is, or correspondingly, that the operation of this world and the structure of it is fluid, that it can be manipulated and it can be changed. So it opens out great possibility, but yeah, it leads to a lot of effectively a personal and a social come down, because apart from the sort of chemical consequences of that, apart from what might be the personal, the psychological consequences of that, how do you follow through on that vision? How do you make that vision actually work? Once you are shown that, it's like Hassan Sabbah's garden. You're given a glimpse of it and it drives you on, and you might be able to extract a kind of political potentiality from that. But it also comes with the weight, the responsibility of actually following through on that and doing it and building it.
Here is another sidebar. James mentioned Hassan Sabbah's garden, an old story, part history, part hallucination, about the medieval Persian mystic and revolutionary Hassan Sabbah, the leader of the sect that became known in the West as the Assassins. Now, according to legend, Hassan created a secret garden hidden within his mountain fortress of Alamut. It was said to be a vision of paradise itself, flowing water, music, intoxicating perfumes, wine, hashish, and beautiful companions wandering beneath the trees. Young initiates were supposedly drugged and carried into this hidden garden while unconscious. When they awoke, they believed that they had entered heaven. Then, just as suddenly, they were removed from it again, returned to the ordinary world, but forever changed. Hassan would then promise that absolute obedience, even death, would grant them a permanent return to paradise. Now, whether any of this actually happened is doubtful. Most historians think the story was exaggerated, distorted, or invented entirely by hostile chroniclers and fascinated travellers like Marco Polo. But the myth endured because it speaks to something deeper, the manipulation of reality, the manufacture of belief, the idea that power belongs to those who can control perception itself. And centuries later, the legend resurfaced inside modern counterculture. William S. Burroughs became obsessed with Hassan Sabbah, repeating the phrase often attributed to him, "Nothing is true, everything is permitted." For Burroughs, Hassan's garden was no longer simply a medieval fable. It became a metaphor for media, politics, drugs, religion, advertising, all the systems capable of constructing artificial realities around us. And in many ways, the psychedelic underground of the 60s and 70s was haunted by exactly the same question. If paradise can be manufactured, what else can?
To make a sort of an alternative world work, it needs significantly more than a sense of vision. It needs community cohesion, it needs infrastructure, it needs sustainability, it needs to be maintained. And you think about that kind of that great escape, a kind of great retreat. Theodore Roosevelt called it the great refusal, of people kind of moving into communal living, whether that is a rock band trying to get it together in the country or people who formerly at High Ashbury moving out into more rural areas. The vision is there. You are pursuing that vision. You are trying to realize that desire, but you're sort of almost immediately confronted with its impossibility. And I think that accounts for a lot of disillusionment and sort of burnout and disappointment.
A lot of artists and cultural figures at the time, did recognize what was going on. Joan Didion, in her essays, Kenneth Anger, making his films, and they did sort of see this. And in fact, there was this kind of almost like apocalyptic end of the world imagery going on for quite a few artists and filmmakers, right? So it wasn't that even at the time that they were sort of unconscious about what was happening. I mean, Hunter Thompson, is another classic, isn't it, in terms of literature, right? He saw what was happening and wrote it as it was, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you put those people together, Hunter S. Thompson, John Didion, Kenneth Anger, ostensibly they might not have that much connection between them other than they're the kind of writers that you might find on certain kinds of bookshelves. They're probably on your bookshelf. But you could look at their sort of sensibilities as being actually quite different. But I suppose what connects them all is they're sort of observers of the culture. They're not really fully kind of participants. Even someone like Hunter S. Thompson, who prided himself as actually the gonzo involvement, he's observing groups like the Hells Angels. He's observing the counterculture. As with Joan Didion, she's there at the periphery, offering these portraits of people who are very much involved in it. She's experiencing, or certainly writes about a certain degree of paranoia. They're sort of engaged with, but not really fully aware of how it actually operates. And similarly, someone like Kenneth Anger, older than the sort of typical hippie, trying to make a sort of film version of this culture coming into being. But what he's got his attention on is the next wave, the celebratory Dionysian culture seen in San Francisco. That's the transitionary period, effectively the culture that's going to get blown away by this wave. So Didion, Thompson, Anger, they're sort of observers. They're witnessing, but they're not fully part of. And I think that's what gives rise to a lot of these texts in the period, which are quite ominous, which don't really have the celebratory quality that you might expect to find. And they're quite ambivalent and they're nervous and anxious. This literary perspective has its eye a little bit further down the road.
You frame this discussion with one kind of incident or one kind of cultural artifact. That's John Lennon and Yoko Ono's experimental short film, Apotheosis, because they got this image of this hot air balloon. It's like their desire to ascend. But of course, they're ascending and they're escaping the world, you could say, they're escaping gravity. At the same time, it's an experiment which has them sort of suspended, right, between these utopian visions, aspiration, and being exhausted, disillusioned with it all.
Yeah, because not only do you have the enormous resonance of John Lennon and Yoko Ono, which is, again, they're sort of archetypes of the 1960s. Their progress really sort of sums up a lot of these themes in terms of what happened. Yeah, I just thought that short film sort of crystallized. It seems to be so gestural, so airy, so inconsequential. Let's take a balloon ride. It's so fantastical. But at the same time, it speaks of a great desire to escape. And it also speaks of a real precarity in doing that, because you can't really get far in a hot air balloon.
You don't know where it's going to land.
Yeah, you have no idea where it's going to land. It's very chaotic. But also the viewpoint that they're offering. Are they escaping from the world as they rise up? Or is the world completely retreating from them?
I think we can agree then that, the 60s were not simply an era of peace and love interrupted by a few tragic events. This decade contained within itself the seeds of its own collapse. So all these impulses that drove people towards, expanded consciousness and radical freedom and spiritual transformation also contained the seeds of paranoia, violence, narcissism. That's all true, and let's accept that that's all true. But let's end on a positive note. What do you feel were the wonderful things about that decade, about the counterculture, and that went on into the 70s and even right up until now that actually we should be thankful for, and in a way we could even be romantic about?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a reason why we still listen to this great music and watch these fabulous films. I mean, they don't stay with such an enormous amount of culture to choose from. If it's not great, it's not going to stick around. And there's something about the cultural production of the decade, the courage of it, the vibrance of it, the sheer talent of it, that has, like it or not, has gifted us with an enormous amount of absolutely fabulous art that continues to inspire, even when that art is talking about crisis and catastrophe and so on and so forth. The White Album is both a great album and a great essay, right? And I think we should be sort of thankful for those gifts. I also think that if we want to think, well, okay, the 60s kind of ends, that kind of ring fences it to just a few years. But the 60s chronologically became the 1970s, and a lot of those political projects carried on into the 1970s and after, and found form, found purchase, and had direct social effects. And I would say that in terms of a cultural legacy, as great as the music is, as great as the art is, I'd say that it's actually the empowering legacy of the so-called New Left that we should be thankful for from the 1960s, that got us to think about social and sexual rights, to think about the left and the right wing is not just to think about opposed parties, but it's to think about how you interact with each other in gestures and thoughts and speech. The 60s somehow were performed in the 70s. If you think about sort of protest movement of the 1960s, the real work was actually done in the following decades. Certainly, if you see the way in which feminism developed, racial identities developed in the following decades, I think we sort of have the 60s to thank for that, but the real work was done afterwards.
Anyway, we don't need to talk so much about the shadow of the 70s because it was kind of pretty obvious to us, isn't it? But all sorts of things happened because of the 60s. Just the environment, and food. These ideas about health and self-actualization, alternative medicines, mysticism and personal transformation moved into the mainstream, right? So, James, I hope that you might come back and talk about that, actually, because the growth of the self-help movement, which is still with us, isn't it? And New Age therapies, it really kind of ballooned in the 70s. It'd be great if you could come back to talk about that. But in the meantime, James Riley, thanks very much for coming to talk about the bad trip and the 1960s.
It's my absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks to James. Check out his book, The Bad Trip, for much more on the dark side. As I said, for me, this shadow doesn't diminish the 60s dream. It just gives it more depth. It makes it more interesting. And culturally and artistically, it gave us so much more than the lovely, if lightweight version evinced by the songs If You're Going to San Francisco, Be Sure to Wear Flowers in Your Hair, or This Is the Dawning of the Age of Aquarius. Wonderful, where we are. And with regarding to the culture, I'll put a long list of countercultural films in our Patreon. Come and join us. You can choose to support us with a contribution if you can, but you can also join for free to get essays, tips, and all sorts of goodies. We've got some wonderful things coming up. But for now, in the meantime, thanks for listening. Let's keep listening. And I will see you, hear you, and meet you further down the road, round the bend, and over the hillsides for more of these tales from the other side.